Hey, I'm Carl, and I've got a question for you. Do you want to know how to do blends like this purple highlighting on this guy's cloak? Well, then you're in the right place because I'm about to show you. This is what I call sponge blending or sponge highlighting. And essentially it uses makeup sponges and it's very much like dry brushing in that we use essentially two types of paint, a undercoat or a base coat and a highlight color. And we base coat it like this guy's been base coated purple. And then you use the highlight color, load the sponge up, and then just dab it on top. There's a little bit more nuance to it though, and a few little tips and tricks that you might want to keep watching to figure out. I've got some Liquitex Flow Aid here that I'm going to be using to kind of make this highlight color flow a little bit better. I'll shake up my highlight color, get it on my wet palette. So there's a lot of little things that I'm still experimenting with regards to this technique. The flow aid is one of them. I'm working with different mediums and flow aids to kind of make it work a little bit, make the paint a little bit easier to work with and flow off the sponge a little more. This is a very wet paint, as you can see. It's very runny. If I draw it out, we can see how it's beading. Flow aid, you can experiment on your own with, instead of using a Liquitex product like that, you can experiment with using dish soap and water. Apparently those have similar kind of viscosity properties. So that's one thing to give a shot at. And I'm also going to be using these tweezers to help me control the sponge. The last thing I'm going to be using is scissors to cut the sponge into workable pieces. So for this area, I don't want just this giant sponge all loaded with paint. I want kind of just like a small square. But I do want it to be larger and flatter. So I'm going to use the back of the sponge. I'm just going to cut it in half. And then I'm just going to cut it this way so it's a little more controllable. All right, so now I've got my little big square sponge here. That looks good. I'm going to grab it like so, and I'm going to load it up, just dab it into the paint, and kind of dab it around on the palette to even out the pigment load. I mean, kind of forceful here to push a lot of the paint out. And I'm going to take this over to my little paper towel here. I'm going to make sure that I'm not overloaded. And that's kind of what I'm looking for, is kind of a light tippy tap sponge. And then for the technique here, I'm going to kind of take it and just tap, tap, tap. We're not trying to go too hard. We don't want to force too much of the paint out of the sponge because that'll overload an area. And what we want to do is kind of build up a little bit of hair or something stuck on the mini. Something dried into the paint. That's okay. So we just want to kind of load it up. And I'm going crosswise here, and letting the folds of this cloak naturally kind of build up the paint where I want it to be. So it's naturally avoiding this kind of inner recessed area there. And just tippy tap tap, taking my time, not pushing too hard. And I can come in here for that area, kind of tap it into that area, build up a little highlight there. And already that paint is looking pretty good. So for areas like larger areas, you know, once in a while you're going to reload up your sponge because it's going to exhaust a bunch of the paint that it's going to do. I'm just going to come and do large areas like this and just using like very gentle, but like I'm not trying to squish the brush, the sponge into the model, but I'm being firm because you need to be firm to load the paint. And this is something that it's going to take me time to really perfect this technique and this method, because it is very different than traditional kind of layering and brushing techniques. But it does get a pretty dang good result though. And it's nice and soft. Compared to dry brushing I find tends to be very streaky, especially on these kind of cloaks, and it's difficult to control the amount of load that you put in different areas. I developed this technique mostly because I was having a really hard time doing these shoulder pad pauldrons with dry brushing, trying to dry brush a similar kind of highlight into the center of it, because my layering technique with this particular purple, it's got so much white in it that it's really quite difficult to layer successfully. At least I found it very difficult to layer successfully. If you do too much, you can always knock it back down. You can always come back in with actual purple, with the same darker purple, and kind of tap it back down to lower the intensity. That's another thing that you can do. This sponge is too big though to do these smaller areas. So I'm going to come in and cut a smaller sponge, like so. I'm going to use, again, I'm going to use the back side that I kind of cut because it's going to be a little more easy to use. Grab a little bit of my purple, load it up, kind of swish it around a little bit. See if I can get, yeah, that's looking good. And then for these areas in here that are a little more detailed and delicate, now I have a smaller sponge that I can use to kind of get in there and tippy tap tap those areas. This is super easy compared to like other methods that I've tried to use before. And it naturally doesn't really get into the recesses because like the sponge is mechanically keeping you from doing that. So raised areas just kind of get covered nicely. You can eventually combine this with a little bit of edge highlighting and that'll really pop out these shoulders, or you can go up a shade and it will actually punch up this technique even more. For these areas we want to be very careful though. Yeah, sometimes the corner of your sponge will get loaded and you'll accidentally put too much paint in an area. This shoulder pad area, I'm just going to kind of tap from the center with the corner of my little sponge here. And I want to establish kind of the central highlight in the middle. And as I do that, what will happen is that I keep on calling it a brush, but the sponge will naturally become less and less loaded with paint as I tap it over to the sides. And it should create a nice soft fall off as I tap lighter and lighter and deposit less and less paint because there's just less paint on the sponge area. So that'll get you a nice fall off kind of effect. If it's an area that you think needs more paint, just go back over it, and that's about all you need to do. It's very important you don't get any water in your paint mix when you're doing this though, because I'm using a wet palette, so there's a little bit of water in there, but like if you get this moist, the paint will just spread. It'll become liquidy, which is what you don't want. You want it to kind of stick where you stamp it into. You don't want it to flow, which is ironic because I'm using flow aid, but flow aid is more breaking up the surface tension and allowing this to come off the sponge a little easier than what it would be doing if it was actually being mixed with water, which is that it would actually be flowing into the recesses and like kind of pooling where you don't want it to be. You want it to stick where you want to put it. And it's just that easy. Like that took me maybe 5 minutes to do. So if you're looking to punch up your miniatures and you have a bunch of miniatures like these kind of guys with cloaks, and you want to kind of push a little bit more intense color into them, this technique is simple. It's cheap because you already have the paint. You don't need the flow aid. You can do this with raw paint. I just like the flow aid. I think it helps out a little bit. It's cheap because makeup sponges are like $2, and you don't need the tweezers to actually complete this technique. You can do it just with the sponge and the scissors. One thing to look out with when you're doing this technique though is that if you keep on applying too much paint in an area, it'll actually like remove paint from the center of the area you're trying to remove it from, or you're trying to apply more paint to. So the harder you push, one of the reasons why we have a light touch with this is that the harder you push, the more paint might actually get picked up by the sponge, because the flow aid that I'm using at least is very liquidy. So again, we want to work from the inside of like highlight areas to the outside of highlight areas. That's basically this guy done. Didn't take very long. All it really needs is a purple wash to kind of unify it, and he is pretty good. Other examples of this technique that I've used is this kind of color blending technique, where I've gone from the dark gray to this kind of brighter green, and I'm going to demonstrate that technique really quickly on these banshees that I've been working on. So I got one of these banshees here. I'm going to use this one because it's got like a lot of extreme contours to it. I'm going to start with this blue-green, Vallejo model color blue-green. And this is just going to go down as kind of a base color in like really broad, intense bands. And the idea behind it is going to be that those areas are going to be in recesses and are going to be difficult for me to sponge into. And I want them to stay naturally darker. So I've lettered my, mixed up my paint here, a little bit of water, just a little, and I'm just going to come in, I'm going to roughly kind of sketch in this teal detail. It doesn't have to be very good. We're going to be going over this many times. We're even going to incorporate some of this teal into our sponging technique, so don't worry about that too much. If you get into raised areas, who cares? It's all going to get mixed down essentially. All right, so this is all nice and dried. And you know, there's some areas that are missing and it's not perfect, and it doesn't really matter. Not for this technique. We're gonna be layering so much on top of this that it doesn't really factor into it. So now what we want to do here is we want to grab our little sponge. We're going to grab a large flat area on the sponge, and I'm just going to cut this one again to size. Doop. There we go. And what we're going to do here is we're actually going to blend on the sponge, and that's going to give us essentially a color stamp that we can stamp in here and get that nice transitional color. So I'm going to grab my sky blue, which is kind of my mid-tone blue for this, and I'm just going to put this on the palette here, just off to the side like that. And I'm just going to put a drop of flow aid into both of these. So a drop of flow aid on him, and then a drop of flow aid there. To load this up, it's quite simple. I'm gonna, for the top, because I want this area to be blue and I want that area to be teal, I'm gonna load the top of this up with blue and the bottom of it with teal. And I'm gonna kind of drag it back and forward on my palette, and you see how it's kind of created that nice thing. So if we come in here and we stamp with it, it's got a nice transition to it. Maybe a little bit more rubbing. This is something that's very much feel. I haven't found the greatest way to do this other than just feel, but that's looking pretty good. So now I'm going to come in here and kind of start layering up these colors. So a nice little trick that I've just thought of while working on this miniature was that this area in here was really quite not blending particularly well. So I loaded my brush up with some of this kind of mid-blend paint and this kind of back and forth area that I've done. And I'm just kind of coming in now and just doing very light, almost glaze-like paint level with this brush here. But the pre-blend is already done up here, so I can just come up and kind of sample that and really lightly tap it in. Actually, upon reflection, I think that what I'm actually doing here is more wet blending than it is any kind of layering, because that flow aid, I feel, is really allowed me to actually have more work time. Every type of layering or blending technique that I've tried with other mediums and attempts like that has always kind of ended up with kind of mixed results, with darker stuff being just better in general. This layering technique here, actually, this flow aid works quite well. I still like the sponge for the large areas though, getting this done really quickly. That's quite nice, but the flow aid, the Liquitex flow aid, is the stuff that's actually letting me kind of work this paint into the right area. That and this kind of mixed palette that I've developed here as I've been working on this miniature. That looks pretty good though. I'm pretty darn happy with it. I really like the back too. Maybe I can smooth out some of these areas. I'm going to call that basically done for the top. The only thing that I need to do now is kind of do the white. There's lots of different whites you can be using. I'm going to be using Vallejo model color white, which is just a regular ass white. Generally very chalky, but the flow aid should make it Well, all whites are usually very chalky, unfortunately, but the flow aid should smooth out the chalkiness, and the application that I'm using, if I'm very gentle with it, should be okay. So I'm using quite a lot of flow aid. This is almost a 1-to-1 ratio for most of the flow aid that I'm adding. So this is going to be a really intense step, so I really want to like get all of the extra excess paint that's kind of in this off before we kind of start bringing back in this white. And this is very much similar to the pure kind of highlighting technique we were using on the Stormcast earlier in the video, because all we're doing right now is we're not doing a solid blend, we're doing a simple kind of we're doing a, how would you say, a gradual blend by varying the application in different areas and being gentle with it, essentially. And white is naturally very transparent. This is why I save it for this step. And as you can kind of see, this area right here is getting very minty as I work up with it. And what I want to do is kind of erase this really hard line and replace it with like a really smooth transition between the kind of stark sky blue and the white. And already we're seeing like this really nice ice blue transition from like this nice dark teal to the mid-tone blues to the white. And, you know, it's not going to win you a golden demon, but it's going to definitely impress some people on the tabletop, and didn't take me more than 20 minutes to do, really. You know, for me, for this kind of effect, that's a winner in my book. The nice thing about this white too is that we can use it just overall to kind of hide our little mistakes. There's some crunchiness in this this transition layer area inside there that I'm just going to come in and kind of tap out, and then I can come back in with my other color here. Just make sure I grab it in like a nice even way. And if I just load that back up, and I can come back in and I can tap in some better transition color, because the white kind of resets the undercoat, right? And that can let me just kind of come back in and tippy tap that area back in. I'm super happy, and I'll show some photos of this finished model once I've got it all completely done. That's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching, and I'd really like it if you'd like and subscribe to this video, because it gives me huge motivation to know people actually care about what I'm working on. You know, I'm not going to be the giant YouTube channel that everyone goes to for painting, but hopefully I can kind of share my experiments with people, and everyone can benefit from it.